Well, thank you. Thank you for welcoming me here. I have really felt uh, at home, even though it's my first time here. And I really appreciate how many people have just come up and said hello. And I don't have to tell you that when you look through a telescope, you look back in time. And I want to do another kind of looking back in time tonight to uh, to the time of the women of my story, starting in the late 19th century and going into the 20th, because the things that they worked on really laid the foundations for two very important issues today. The classification of the stars began back then, something that terms you use every day in describing stars, and also the beginnings of astrophotography. The things you see here probably won't impress you after seeing some of the photographs taken by members, but we'll address the humble beginnings. So I'm going to stand over here so I can see what I'm talking about. Shall I just signal each time? So this was the Harvard Observatory, and you notice there was a great big telescope, a Mertz and Mahler, and there was a smaller telescope dome. But then there was another wing of the building which didn't have a dome, which was where the director lived. And because the director lived on site, he got his family to participate in the work of the observatory. Uh, Wives, sisters, daughters, all played a part. And there was plenty to do. They were called computers because there was a lot of computing work, copying work, record keeping. Let's have the next slide. Um, hmm, that's not showing up right. I don't know why, but Edward has covered over his name and the dates of his birth and death. So it's, all right, there he is as a young man. You'll see him later, older and a little heftier. But he was only 30 years old when he took over as director at the observatory. And there was controversy about whether he was the right person because he wasn't really an astronomer. He was more known as a physicist. And he had been teaching at MIT for 10 years. And he was a wonderful educator. He created a laboratory where students really learned by doing hands-on experiments that he designed and that they performed by themselves. And if women were interested in sitting in on his courses, he allowed that. Okay. And one of the reasons he did that was he was a real booster of women. His mother was educated. He was married to a highly intelligent woman, Lizzie Sparks Pickering. She was the daughter of former Harvard President Jared Sparks. So he was not afraid of smart women. And there was an idea at the time that young women should really not go to college or overtax their minds because it would affect their ability to bear children. So this book, Sex and Education, A Fair Chance for the Girls, looks like it's asking people to overlook that prejudice, but in fact, it was endorsing it and really claimed that too much mental activity would affect a young woman's reproductive organs and render her sterile. So this was one of the first jobs of the American Association of University Women, was to test this idea by going around to women who'd gone to college and asking them if they'd had children. And guess what? You can go to college and have children. So I said you might not be impressed by some of the photographs, but this was taken in 1888. And the idea was the great thing about photography, when you would have a permanent record, you wouldn't have to spend your time at the telescope drawing. And because the photographic film would absorb light over time, as the retina cannot, you would see a lot more stars if you had a long exposure. The bright stars get overexposed, but others show up, and sometimes, or much of the time, they are stars you never knew existed. Next slide, please. So that image, that 1888 image, when I saw that, really reminded me of Galileo's image of the same constellation, which he drew, because the same thing had happened to him. When he looked at Orion with a telescope, there were many more stars than he could see with the naked eye, even though he wasn't photographing, just the increase in visual power. But then when that was combined with the time exposures in photographs, we really started to see more and more and more stars. Okay. So Pickering wanted to map the heavens. Most of the images look like this. They're negative, so the stars appear dark on a light background. Next slide, please. And objects of interest passing through were photographed. This slide, this is the beginning of one of his most important projects, and it starts with a love story. This is Dr. Henry Draper and his wife, Anna Palmer Draper. And Henry was a medical doctor, like some people here, with a lifelong interest in chemistry, astronomy, astrophysics, and photography. And since his father took one of the very early astrophotographs, he was extremely interested in that. And he was the first person who succeeded in taking a photograph of a stellar spectrum. And he thought this was fantastic. This would be the way to understand the chemistry of the stars. And he had a wonderful way of describing this in his talks. He said that the invention of stellar spectroscopy has made the chemist's arms millions of miles long. So they worked together. She was an independently wealthy heiress, and she got interested in astronomy with him, and together they took photographs, and they had this idea of photographing the stellar spectra to create a classification system. And they organized their lives around this. He quit teaching at NYU. They had a private observatory outside New York City, and they were just about to move up there and carry out this project when he fell ill. He developed pneumonia and died. He was only 45 years old. And she was devastated and determined somehow she was going to carry on his work. And that would be her monument to him, because they had no children. And she determined to do that. First, she thought she could hire a couple of assistants, because she couldn't imagine anybody else who knew as much as Henry did. So maybe if she got 2 people, she had a prayer. But there were various problems, and she didn't think she could do it herself. And Edward Pickering, who had known them, said that he would be very happy to take over this project. And she insisted on providing the funding for it. And she funded it at an extremely generous level. Her first check was $1,000, and the observatory had no support from the university. It was completely self-supporting by, like tonight, you ask the people who support your work to donate, make a subscription. Pickering was often chipping part of his own salary into the work of the observatory. But she volunteered to pay, and she was very particular that she would be entirely responsible for this project. She didn't want anybody else's money in it. Next slide, please. So this is your typical textbook picture of a stellar spectrum with the solar spectrum, Fraunhofer lines, and then an illustration of what is meant by the terms redshifted and blue shifted. So when the light is redshifted because the object is moving away from us, the lines, the familiar Fraunhofer lines, move toward the red, and when the star is moving toward us, they get blue shifted toward the blue. Next slide, please. But of course, Henry Draper didn't have color photography, so his best photographs from the Henry Draper Memorial, images taken using Mrs. Draper's money and telescopes that she donated to the observatory, they looked like this. His plan was to take one spectral image at a time, but Pickering was in a big hurry, and his idea was to put the prisms at the objective end of the telescope and get lots of spectra at once. Next slide, please. And so the images looked like this. So every little smudge on here is a stellar spectrum, and the black spot is a penny, just for scale. This is another portrait of Mrs. Draper. As I said, she was independently wealthy, and Henry had managed her fortune, so it was even better than when she inherited it. And she was actively involved in the work at the observatory. She and Pickering exchanged letters several times a week over a period of decades, and they never arrived at a first-name basis. It was always, "My dear Professor Pickering, my dear Mrs. Draper." And she visited often and was very supportive of everyone involved with the work of the Henry Draper Memorial. Next slide, please. So here they are. Mrs. Draper's money allowed Pickering to hire quite a number of women. There were 6 women already working at the observatory when he arrived. So he doesn't get credit for the idea of hiring women. He just gets credit for the idea of acknowledging that they could do the work extremely well. And they were cheaper. And he was a practical man, so being able to hire more people was a great advantage. His beef with many observatories was that they were gathering information all the time, but it wasn't made public, it wasn't analyzed. And his point was, if we take all these pictures and nobody sees them, what's the point? So he would lend out pictures to other researchers, but he really wanted the material on the plates broken down, recorded in many ways, studied. So the plates would be mounted in these wooden frames, and at the bottom of the frame is a mirror. So the light comes in the window, daylight, and shines up through the plate. And then the person looking at the plate is holding a magnifying loupe, because you saw how tiny the spectra are. And calling out to a recorder positions and then an estimation of spectral type. Um, the woman standing at the back is Williamina Fleming, who uh, was in a supervisory position by the time this photograph was taken. The woman at the back is using a modified telescope to look at the plates. Everything is recorded, organized. Pickering is just looking on proudly, as well he should. Next slide, please. So here's a close-up of sitting examining the plates. You can tell that this is a staged photograph because the window shade is down. So there's no way she could actually see anything on that plate. But it is a very evocative picture, I think. Next slide, please. So Mrs. Fleming came to the observatory, or came to this country from Scotland, and she got her job at the observatory, actually in the residence, as a maid. She was rather desperately looking for a job because her husband had disappeared and she was pregnant. And the Pickerings realized immediately that she was much too intelligent to be working as a maid. So they moved her into the observatory and taught her how to determine star positions on the plates. And then they helped her go home to Scotland to have her baby. And because she was such a good worker, Pickering offered her a real job if she would come back. So she went back to Scotland. She had her baby. You know, imagine what that trip was like. And she stayed with her mother and grandmother for 2 years. She named the baby Edward Charles Pickering Fleming. Some people will tell you she named him that because Pickering was really the father. But no. If he was really the father, she would never have named him that. That would have been the last choice of name. So she did come back, and she was put on the task of developing the classification system for the Henry Draper Memorial. She was the first one to work on that. So in each of those little spectra, she's seeing some pattern of lines, and she's grouping them into boxes accordingly. And because she doesn't know what the differences signify, nobody knows yet, she just gives them an alphabetical designation. Next slide, please. The activity of the observatory, the number of telescopes in use all through the night, every night, generated an enormous number of glass plates. And Pickering lived in mortal fear of fire. The original observatory building, which is at the back in this image, is a wooden structure. And it was his nightmare that there would be a fire and all this material would be destroyed. So in 1893, this building, this was called the brick building because it was a brick building and therefore considered safe storage for the plates. And all the women who worked on the plates moved into the brick building with them. Of course, this building is still at Harvard, but it's surrounded by, it doesn't look freestanding like that anymore, but it is still there, still holding the plates. And the plates got moved from the observatory into the building on a pulley system, crates of them, about 100 at a time, and nothing broke. Next slide, please. In addition to the women who worked at the observatory rarely had more than a high school education at first, but that was all they needed. If they were smart and they were good at numbers, they could learn what needed to be done. But Antonia Mori was the first one who came who had a college education. She was a Vassar graduate, and she had studied astronomy at Vassar with Maria Mitchell. Maria Mitchell, who also had worked as a computer for the Coast Survey, but then was the first woman hired as professor of astronomy at Vassar, and Antonia Mori was her student and was the niece of Henry Draper. So she had a lot of cred to work at the observatory, and she used different photographs. She was really looking at large single spectrum photographs. And so she didn't like Mrs. Fleming's system and invented something that was more complicated and to reflect the greater detail in the images that she was looking at. So for a while, there were two classification systems. And Mrs. Fleming published the first Draper catalog of 10,000 stars. And Pickering credited her in his introduction to the volume, said that all of the work was really hers. Next slide, please. So Miss Mori took a very long time to publish her classification. And when she finally did, she got her own byline. So the first page of her classification is actually signed by Antonia Mori. And she was present at the discovery of the first spectroscopic binary. And then she discovered one herself. So the spectra were now providing a way not only to show what the star was made of, what type it might be, whether it was moving towards us or away from us, but whether it was a binary star. Next slide, please. Another college graduate to come to the observatory was Annie Jump Cannon, who was a Wellesley alumna, and she was the first woman who used the telescope. She was not just a computer. She was also a telescope observer. Next slide, please. In this picture, Miss Cannon is the third one from the right, and she's not a student here. She's gone back to Wellesley as an assistant to the observatory director, Sarah Frances Whiting, who had taken Pickering's course at MIT and went back to Wellesley and taught physics the way he had taught it at MIT. And Annie Jump Cannon was her student, and through her got to know about the Harvard Observatory and wound up working there. Next slide, please. And this lovely children's book about her shows her observing on the roof of the observatory. I think it's more likely she would have been in the dome, but I really like this picture. Next slide, please. So this is a typical one of Miss Cannon's plates. So the spectra get numbers, and then she's looking at them and calling out the number to her recorder, and then the alphabetic designation. And in her analysis of the spectra, she combined bits of Mrs. Fleming's and Miss Mori's systems, and she's the one who juggled the alphabetical order of Mrs. And that's why we have O, B, A, F, G, K, M. It's because of Miss Cannon. the, the types of stars memorized by generations of astronomy students as, "Oh, be a fine girl, kiss me." And she was able to make judgments so quickly. Everybody remarked on it. It was almost a visceral reaction. She'd look at the picture and come up with a designation. And she often went back over plates and redid them just to check herself, and they would come out the same. Next slide, please. So one of the great things I enjoyed about this project was getting to do research in the Harvard archives, where all sorts of things turned up, including a box labeled Miss Cannon's Diaries. And that's really what's in there. She was a lifelong diarist. Unfortunately, she had a really terrible handwriting. So, but I got the hang of it after a while. In that message right at the top from 1941, she went to Boston early. She mailed both her income taxes. Then she's been classifying from 1:30 to 4. 4 got cut off. And then Cecilia brought me home at 4:15. Cecilia Payne Gaposchkin. Next slide, please. So to really photograph the whole sky, you need the southern hemisphere. And Pickering sent out reconnaissance parties to California, South America, and this was the first Mount Harvard in Peru. Yeah, it looked pretty rugged, but it wasn't a great site, so they kept on looking. But next slide, please. And they eventually wound up in the lee of a dormant volcano called El Misti, mostly dormant. And they put up several telescopes, and Pickering's younger brother was made the first director there and built this rather elaborate hacienda and pretty much got himself fired for insubordination. Next slide, please. And this was the great telescope created for the southern hemisphere. And Pickering was an extremely charming man. And the proof of it is this telescope, because when it was announced that he needed $50,000 to build this telescope, another heiress stepped forward and wrote him a check. And that was Catherine Wolfe Bruce of New York City. And she had come very late in life to an interest in astronomy, but she got very interested and read a lot about it. She didn't visit the observatory. She was elderly and not all that well, but she was extremely enthusiastic and exchanged wonderful letters with Pickering, and all of those are also at the Harvard Observatory. Not to mention Pickering's entire lifetime. If anybody wants to write a biography of Edward Pickering, and I hope somebody does, everything is there, including letters he wrote to his mother when he was a child. So this telescope, the lenses were made in France, and they waited 3 years to get them. So people were just both Miss Bruce and Pickering were commiserating with each other. Would they ever see this finished? Next slide, please. And I'm happy to say Sarah Schechner and Ken Lowney, who are, of course, longtime Stellafane participants, they very kindly took me out to the old Oak Ridge site where the Bruce telescope had been returned after its long life, and they retrieved the optics and set them up, and I believe this is on exhibit now at Harvard in the Wheatland Collection of Historical Scientific Instruments. Next slide, please. This is the scene at Peru when William Pickering was returned to Boston. Solon Bailey, who was the person who had really found the site, done all the exploration and testing. So he went down as director with his wife, Ruth Poulter Bailey, who was at the far right. And then he's the first man in from the right. And it was a very congenial group of people there. They worked hard, but they also knew how to enjoy life, as you can see. Next slide, please. Bailey was especially interested in globular clusters and in variable stars in the clusters, as he called them, cluster variables. And one of the first things he had to do was to just count the number of stars that you could see in an image like this. And so he would rule a grid on a blank glass plate and hold that over one of these images and then count how many stars in each box. And Ruth did the same to check him. And where they didn't agree, they averaged. But as you can see, when you get to the middle, you can't really count. You just get an upper estimate. Next slide, please. So the images get sent back to Cambridge for analysis by the ever-growing team here. Mrs. Fleming is not in this picture because by the time it was taken, she had died. But Miss Cannon is in the middle. She's quite tall. She's got her hair piled up. So there's Pickering. Pickering's obvious. And then to Pickering's left, there's a petite woman. And then the next one over, that's Miss Cannon. And Miss Levitt is not in the picture either because she was home when this was taken. Next slide, please. Here she is. We have a bug on her face. Yeah, I apologize somehow in transferring the PowerPoint from my laptop to the thumb drive for this laptop. We lost some of the type, but at least the pictures are here. So she was also a college graduate. She went to Radcliffe, which was not yet Radcliffe, but the Institute for the Collegiate Instruction of Women. And one of the things Pickering did to forward women's careers was to hold a class for the women at Radcliffe. He didn't teach it, but he organized it, and Arthur Searle, who was another observer, usually taught that class. And then the young women who were really interested might come over to work at the observatory as volunteers, just to get a sense of what the work was like, and then some of them really moved in, got hired. And that's how she got there. And she was extremely skilled, but she was not well and had to go home from time to time with various health problems. Next slide, please. And she was given several assignments, but mostly to look for new variable stars. And of course, to determine a star's variability, you have to see how its brightness changes over time. And the way brightness, there were several techniques they used for assessing brightness on the glass plates, but this was one of her favorites. So these objects were called fly spankers. And her joke was that it was because they're very tiny. The glass part was maybe a couple of inches, and the the wire handle was just 3 or 4 inches long. So Miss Levitt said that these were too small to do a fly much damage. So it was just a fly spanker. And so on the glass part of the plate are images of stars with a magnitude designation written right on there. And so you can hold that on your glass plate and compare what's on this key to the plate and make your determinations. And if you have the non-emulsion side of the plate up, you can write on it. And they often did write on the plate in colored ink. I should have pointed that out earlier. You can see colored ink markings on many of the plates. Next slide, please. So this is Miss Levitt's real claim to fame. When she examined the Bruce telescope plates from the southern hemisphere and she looked at the Magellanic clouds, she discovered 1,777 variable stars. And now we have lots of variable stars, but when this work started, only a couple hundred were known. So the rate of discovery was truly astounding. Everybody commented on it. These women were frequently in the newspaper because people were so surprised at these discoveries. So her real genius was to follow to pick a certain number of these stars. At first she picked about 16 of them, and she really followed the light. She had the complete light curve for 16 variables. And she noticed that it just seemed to her that the brighter the star, the longer the period. And so she noted that in her report. And later on, she analyzed a few more to see if that interesting trend would hold, and it did. And Pickering had started a series of circulars so he could get important news out quickly. They used to publish the annals every year, but he didn't want to wait a whole year when all these exciting things were happening. So he would issue these circulars. And in the circular, he said, Miss Levitt has discovered something truly remarkable. And in the text of that circular, he referred to it as a law. This is 1912. We consider ourselves really modern now because we've suddenly started calling the period luminosity relation the Levitt law. But he was on to something then. So it held true, and she drew the graph that Chris Larson showed in her presentation. Well, you can see the brighter stars have the longer periods, and that led to the first estimate of the distance to the Magellanic clouds. And it was low, but it was on the order of 30,000 light years, which was another very surprising thing at the time, because there didn't seem to be a way to gauge distances that large. So, and it has only grown in importance since that time. Miss Levitt was the first one of the computers whose name I learned, and I learned it from Wendy Friedman when years ago in the 90s, when she was head of the Hubble telescope key project to determine the Hubble constant. I interviewed her for Omni magazine, and she told me about Henrietta Leavitt and how important the Cepheid variables were for the work she was doing with the Hubble telescope, and how interesting it was that this woman who had lived almost 100 years previously, that her work was still relevant. So that was news to me. I'd never heard of Miss Levitt. And then when I went to learn more about her, I found out about all the other women, and that was how I got interested in telling this story. Next slide, please. So Miss Cannon and Miss Levitt, interestingly, were both partially deaf, but that didn't interfere with their work, certainly, or even very much with their enjoyment of life. One of the boxes of Miss Cannon's belongings that I went through consisted entirely of programs from concerts, operas, and plays that she had attended. She wore a hearing aid. She went to lectures. She was extremely sociable, invited the whole group to her home for tea frequently. And she and Miss Levitt were world renowned in their own lifetimes. And Miss Cannon was made an officer of the American Astronomical Society. She was elected treasurer. She was also a foreign member of the Royal Astronomical Society. Next slide, please. I mentioned Maria Mitchell earlier, and she was from Nantucket. And her cousin, Lydia Swain Mitchell, was very interested in the history of Nantucket. She went to live in Philadelphia with her husband, Charles Hinchman, but they would go back to Nantucket every summer. And she'd written a little booklet about Nantucket, and because she was Maria Mitchell's cousin, and they'd both been born in the same house on the island, she really thought they should have an observatory. And she worked very hard to set that up, and she had a lot of help from Pickering. And what she really wanted was to hire one of his workers to come to Nantucket 6 months out of the year and do research and give lectures and really educate the people of Nantucket about astronomy. And this woman, Margaret Harwood, who was a Radcliffe graduate, was the first of these Nantucket fellows. So she spent 6 months at Harvard doing her research there, and then she would go to Nantucket. And she was so successful the first year, they invited her back, and they very quickly made her the permanent Nantucket Fellow. Next slide, please. The Nantucket group, the idea of the fellowship was obviously a wonderful thing, and immediately it seemed there should be more fellowships. So money was raised to provide another Harvard fellowship for some woman to be able to come work at the Harvard University. But there was some problem using the Harvard name, so they changed it to the Pickering Fellowship. And in this picture, the young woman in the plaid dress, that's Mary Van. So she was the first Pickering Fellow. And this was great. They would come, they would work at the observatory for a year, and then they could get a job somewhere else because they had this great experience. Standing to Miss Van's left is Henrietta Levitt, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 from Miss Levitt is Miss Cannon. And you see they allowed a couple of men in the picture too. For obvious reasons, this is known as the paper doll photograph of the Harvard computers. Next slide, please. So after Pickering died, Harlow Shapley became the next director. And Shapley's feeling was that it was really unfortunate that the observatory wasn't really training the next generation of astronomers, and that they should really be offering graduate level courses in astronomy. The teaching at Harvard in astronomy was separate from the observatory, and it was undergraduate only. So to bring in graduate students, he needed money, and the only fellowship money he had were these Pickering fellowships for women. So the first graduate students were all women, recruited from the women's colleges. And I think this was the most startling thing I learned in the course of my research, that because of the history and of Pickering's interest in bringing women in, and then the fellowship being named in his honor, that's what brought in the first graduate students. So Adelaide Ames, in the picture with the globe, was the first one, followed by Helen Sawyer, later Helen Sawyer Hogg, because she married Frank Hogg, who was also a graduate student. He was the first male they let in, and Cecilia Payne. Next slide, please. Cecilia Payne came from England. She heard Arthur Eddington lecture about the 1919 eclipse and decided that's what she wanted to do, become an astronomer. And it quickly became clear that there really was no future for her in England. But she heard Shapley give a guest lecture in London, and she knew about Miss Cannon, and she applied and was accepted as a graduate student and became the first person to earn a PhD in astronomy at Harvard. Next slide, please. Here's more good times. This was the Observatory Pinafore, a light opera with lots of fun poked at Pickering about his many photometers that he developed and his gentlemanly behavior. He never cursed, and in the opera, when he gets angry, he says, "Oh, Polaris." And that is Miss Payne in the title role of Josephine. And on the right, the fellow in the top hat is Bart Bach. Some of you may have heard of him. Next slide, please. Miss Cannon wanted to also endow a prize, and she created a prize for a young woman who distinguished herself somehow in astronomical research. And she thought it would be nice if, instead of just giving somebody money, there was a nice piece of jewelry that you could keep long after the money was spent. And this particular, and it was a different design every time. She would get a woman jeweler to create something on an astronomical theme. And this is the Annie Jump Cannon Award that was won by Margaret Harwood. Next slide, please. So there's been controversy about this Annie Jump Cannon Award. These are some of the recent winners. And some women have felt almost offended by it. Why should there be a separate award for women? Is it a kind of lower thing? So to raise the stature of the award, the winner now gives an invited lecture at an annual meeting of the American Astronomical Society. So it's more prestigious. Next slide, please. This is this year's winner, Eve Lee. She teaches astronomy at McGill University. Next slide, please. So these are the plate stacks at Harvard where all the glass plates are stored. And each one is in a paper envelope that has a lot of information on it. What's the date of the image, which telescope was used, the length of exposure, other conditions. And then as the plate got studied, other people might write things on the paper jackets. And some of them are a whole story of discovery. And the logbooks also are kept. So these are just two images back to back of the same. This is Lindsay Smith Zruel, who was the curator, but uh, recently left that position. Next slide, please. The Bruce telescope had a long, wonderful history in South America, and the people working there continued working through all sorts of adverse conditions, including disease outbreaks. But when they lost the weather, that was it. They could not, no clouds, no rainy season. So they moved to South Africa, to Bloemfontein, and shipped the Bruce telescope there, and continued taking Southern Hemisphere images. Next slide, please. So this was what happened in January 2016 when all Pickering's life he worried about fire, and what happened to the plates? There was a flood. So a water main broke under the building, and thousands of plates got dirtied in this muddy water. And a very important digitization project had begun. Alan Slisky is here. He's been was very involved with planning, designing that, and the equipment. But the flood really made a mess of everything because the equipment was also damaged. But there was insurance, and it all had a very happy ending after a while. Next slide, please. Many of you have seen this movie. My book was not made into a movie. I admit this was a much sexier story, but I'm showing the poster mostly for the person of Alyssa Goodman standing next to the poster, because she's one of the people I asked to read my manuscript as a technical expert. I always get 10 or 12 people to do that because you want to learn about the mistakes before the book is in print. And she apologized to me. She said, I'm really not paying attention to the astrophysics because I am gobsmacked by these women. And she said, here I am at Harvard. I know all of their names, but I always thought it was some cute, quaint chapter in our history. I never realized they were actually doing science. And I think a lot of us women are guilty of that. We think the misogyny comes only from men, but it comes from women too, because we've grown up with those messages. And I have to admit that I found myself constantly surprised, super impressed, wowed by everything they did. And it was definitely wow-making, but I shouldn't have been that surprised, is my feeling. Next slide, please. So there were a lot of Lego sets given away tonight. There are Lego sets of women in astronomy. I have never actually seen these, but here we have Miss Leavitt with her loop, Miss Cannon with her stellar classification, and Cecilia Payne, whose thesis pointed out she came to this country partly because she could work here as a woman astronomer, but also because of the glass plates, because she had a grounding in atomic theory that nobody at the observatory had. And so in her analysis of the spectra, she realized that counterintuitively, the stars were not made of the elements in the same proportions as on Earth, which a lot of people thought would be the case. And she said, no, really, it's virtually all hydrogen and helium. And that seemed so unlikely that she was advised to soft pedal that in her thesis, to not make too much of it. So she actually wrote in her dissertation that the result is probably spurious. Nevertheless, it seems that they really do consist mostly of hydrogen and helium. And it took only 4 years for all the reigning experts to corroborate that idea. So she is shown holding up the symbols from the periodic table for hydrogen and helium. This is my final slide. I love this picture. Of course, it's very posed, but it's just delightful in its way. That's Margaret Harwood sitting on the floor. Antonia Mori is in the foreground in the dark dress. Miss Cannon is at the table with Miss Mori, and you see she isn't even looking up. She's still busy working in this picture. And that, at the drafting table, is Cecilia Payne. So it was a great joy for me to spend so much time with these people, and I'm happy to share their story with you tonight. And I think any one of them would have really loved being here. It certainly has been a pleasure for me. Thank you.
You want to answer just a few questions?
Can we even see anybody? Can we even see anybody?
I don't know. They can yell out.
Okay.
David will answer just a few questions. We don't want to keep her all night. Any burning questions?
Oh. Shout out. I'm so glad you asked that question. I I would bet my life that that story is completely incorrect. And it is a very difficult rumor to quash. Um, I'm going to quote Hertha Ayrton, physicist Hertha Ayrton, who said, "Errors are notoriously hard to correct, but an error that attributes to a man work that was done by a woman has more lives than a cat." Um, but that story, first of all, Pickering was the most polite person. You know, even in the opera, they joke about how he doesn't even curse. So the idea that he would speak that way to his staff is completely unbelievable. Um, he would never have referred to her as my Scottish maid. They had a very respectful relationship. It was a little contentious because she felt she was underpaid, and she wrote about that. But otherwise, they had a very good working relationship. And it's just so where your question really is, where did that come from? And the answer is I don't know, but I'm sure it's just a shorthand. You know, there's an Italian expression, "Se non è vero è ben tornato." You know, if it isn't true, it's a great story, so we'll tell it anyway. Uh, and I think it's just one of those. But even people, you know, I've heard people at Harvard tell me that story. But I would like you all to try to spread the word that that couldn't have happened. It just couldn't have happened. Anybody else want to shout out? All right, maybe you'd rather go up on the hill and look at the stars, because I think that would be great. We could turn off the bright light and get dark adapted and carry on.
And we have some, as a thank you,
Oh,
some
you.
bling
Oh boy.
and memorabilia for you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was incredible.